Well, history is littered with a whole bunch of different stories about endurance, whether it's in serious situations or in joyful situations. But there are a few more harrowing stories of endurance in the face of suffering than that of Louis Zamperini. I hope I'm saying his name right. During the Second World War, Louis, who served in the US Air Force, was one of 3 survivors when his plane holding 11 men crashed in the Pacific Ocean. For the following 47 days, these 3 men drifted on a raft, facing starvation and dehydration. In fact, in those 47 days, one of the 3 survivors succumbed to the elements and passed away. Unfortunately for the remaining 2 men, salvation came in the form of capture from Japanese forces. These 2 men, along with a whole bunch of other captured soldiers, then faced 2 years of unimaginable torture and humiliation. Unlike many other men who faced those 2 years of torture, Louis was one of the few who survived. And could I encourage you that if you haven't heard Louis' story, I would encourage you to go read it. It's quite an incredible story. But as I read his story this week, there was a question that came to my mind again and again. And I wondered if Louis asked himself, will I make it out of this alive? How often did Louis ask himself, how do I keep enduring this pain? Will I make it out alive? In tonight's passage, Jesus shares a parable about a widow who suffered for a long time, and she daily pleads for relief from her pain. And then at the end of the parable, Jesus asks the question, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth? Whilst I'd imagine none of us have faced exactly what kind of pain Louis went through in the Second World War, I think there is something that resonates with each of us about his story. It's something we'll dig into in this parable tonight. Because each one of us, at some point or another, has faced some sort of injustice or some sort of long suffering that has left us asking the question, how long can I endure this? Am I going to make it out the other side of this alive? And can I say, if you haven't yet been through that kind of long suffering, Scripture is very clear that at some point you will. See, for followers of Jesus, we know that God has promised a day of judgment where he will make every wrong right, where he will bring relief to those who have suffered. But if we're honest, if we stop for a second and are really honest with ourselves, that's a really hard promise to trust God with. It's a hard promise to trust God with when just like Louis, the pain feels like it goes on and on and on. And yet, in this parable tonight, Jesus reminds us afresh of exactly why we can cling to God's promises, even if it feels like they take a long time to come to fruition. The widow in this story teaches us that it's not just right, but that it is good for you and I to cry out persistently to God. And we're encouraged to cry out persistently to God because when we do, we ultimately submit ourselves to God's will. And Jesus says that is the only way that we will do that, the only way that we will submit ourselves to God's timing in the midst of suffering is if we fix our eyes forward to glory. So let's dig in. Let's look at crying out persistently. In chapter 18, Luke gives small little statements providing context or purpose to the things that he tells about Jesus. In verse 1 is the first of these, and Luke gives us straight out the purpose of Jesus' parable. Look down with me to verse 1. Luke says, then Jesus told his disciples a parable to show them that they should always pray and not give up. Luke makes it clear from the outset exactly what Jesus' parable is about, and that the lesson here is that we should be persistent prayers who do not give up on calling out to God. And so essentially what's happened here is Luke in verse 1 gives us the punchline, and now he's going to let Jesus tell us exactly why we can be persistent prayers. So look down, let's read together. Verse 2. He said, in a certain town there was a judge who neither feared God nor cared what people thought. So firstly, Jesus introduces us to a character. We learn about the judge. We don't get many specifics on the judge. We don't get told his name. We don't get told where he's from. But all we need to know about this judge is that he neither fears God nor cares what people think about him. Those are rather odd details, and so it's probably a fair assumption that this is not going to be the person that Jesus is going to point to you and I to listen to. But he wants us to hold those details in the back of our mind as we press on. And then verse 3, and there was a widow in that town who kept coming to him with the plea, grant me justice against my adversary. At this point, Jesus introduces our second character. It's a widow who's facing an adversary who pleads with the judge for justice. And what we learn about this widow over the next few verses is that she is incredibly persistent. Verse 3 says that she kept coming to him with her plea. And in verse 4, we're told that the judge kept refusing her, and yet because she was unrelenting in her persistence, by verse 5, we're told that he helps her, not because he has concern for her, but because, in his words, the widow keeps bothering me, and eventually she's going to attack me if I don't do something about it. So what's clear is that this widow is an incredibly persistent woman. In fact, when we read these words, the widow almost comes across a bit like a nagging child. It's incredible, the persistence of a child. That voice that you and I have in our head that tells us, stop asking because you're not going to get it. It's like children don't have that. They will go on and on and on and on in their persistent requests to us. And I think the reason that kids do this is because they know deep down that we can fulfill their requests if only they could persuade our will. They know that Dad could buy an ice cream tonight on the way home from church if only his will was persuaded. They know that Mum could take me to a friend's house tomorrow if only I ask enough. See, they get that we have the ability to answer their cries, and so they keep persisting in order to persuade us to do something about it. And the persistent widow gets that this judge has the ability to do something about her situation, that he has the ability to defend her. And so she persists, hoping that she may persuade his will so that he would help her in a way that only he can. She persists like a child, and I think what Jesus tells us in this parable is that the problem with us is that we don't. Which is an odd thing to say because that nagging and that persistence of a child is not something that we want to make a characteristic of our own. We're too mature for that as adults. And yet Jesus challenged us and said, you are not like the widow. Luke opened by sharing the purpose of this parable. And so when we look at this story, it can be tempting to inject the right Christian answer. But I want to ask you this question. When you look at this woman in the parable, look down at your page for a second. When you look at this woman, what do you make of this woman? Again, don't inject the right Christian answer. Be honest. What do you make of her? What are your thoughts about the kind of person she is when you look down at your page? How do her actions honestly make you feel when you read that she persists? I suspect at this point we fall into one of two categories. And there might be some nuance in this, but I reckon roughly we fall into one of these two camps. The first camp is a sense of disgust at her shamelessness. We might not phrase it like that. That might sound a little bit harsh. But in our hearts, there is something shameful about what this woman is doing. And so it goes a little something like this. At some point, you need to stop asking for help and go and do something about it. At some point, you have to stop nagging and take responsibility for where you are. Are you being proactive in the face of your adversaries? Is there something you can do to help your situation? And even beyond that, why are you in this situation? Who are these adversaries? Why are you bothered by them? Have you done something wrong and now you've ended up in this situation that you don't like? In essence, we look at this woman and we think, what a nuisance. Go and be proactive. The second category we might fall into is that we see that this woman needs to learn to quiet down and just embrace her circumstances. We want to plead with this widow to stop embarrassing herself, to stop persisting and just accept that this is the way life is. The judge isn't listening. Your cries aren't being heard. Stop bothering him and get on with it. This is just how life will be. So one side, we have a cry for the widow to be more proactive in her pursuit of justice. And the other is a desire, a call to embrace the injustice that she faces and accept it. Two ends of the spectrum, a call to be proactive in the face of injustice, and another call to embrace this is how life is. But I think if we dig away at the surface a little bit, we actually have the same problem going on in both cases. And the problem is that our hearts are proud. And in our pride, we want to be the ones to fix the injustice in our life. And so we're going to either fix it by endlessly pursuing the positive outcome, or we're going to fix it by simply embracing and changing our perspective on what we face. When our kids come home and share that they're being bullied, our immediate encouragement is to take proactive steps to deal with it. Tell the bully to stop. Go speak to a teacher. Fight back. Don't fight back. Find somewhere else to sit at lunchtime. Ask your friends for help. Do something about the injustice is what we teach them. Or alternatively, when we see awful things in the news like what happened at Bondi last year, we're shocked. But very quickly we tell ourselves, this is the world that you and I live in, and we have to learn to accept it. You and I, we live in a broken world, and so that's just the way things are. What good is it fighting for justice? Because awful things just keep happening. Now, to be clear, there is something right about both those responses. We should be proactive people who love justice and seek it out where we can. And we should learn to not be lost in the fear of injustice, because that's the world we live in. But when Jesus presents you and I with this nagging widow, it forces you and I to ask, where are our persistent prayers for God to intercede? Why don't I pray persistently again and again and again and again for God to do something about the pain and the suffering and injustice that consumes our lives? In the face of sin and suffering in this world, Jesus presents us with the woman who persistently takes her requests to the one who can do something about it. So when our kids come home and they share with us that they are being bullied, do we teach them to cry out to God for help? To cry out that He would give them relief from their daily struggles and that He would bring justice. When we're confronted with horrendous events like those at Bondi, does it draw us to immediately get down on our knees and persistently cry out to God to bring justice and to bring relief? When we feel abandoned, mistreated, wronged, hurt, ignored, do we cry out to God to intercede and to give us rest and to bring it quickly? Brothers and sisters, being proactive and accepting the reality of sin is good and right. But in this persistent widow, we are reminded of our deep and desperate need to cry out to God daily. God is the judge, the only one who can make all things right, and we are like the widow. We are frail and we are in need of someone to defend us. And so, as followers of Jesus, our call is not to have the right answer to every injustice in the world. Our call is to uniquely stand out as people who cry out to the one who does have every answer, the one who can fix every wrong. But if we're honest with ourselves, crying out persistently is very rarely easy, is it? For those who have cried out persistently in the faces of trials and wrestles, you know that Jesus isn't describing the easy out here. This is not the easy path for the lazy. What Jesus is describing here is an act of faith. He says, cry out and trust. Have faith that God is in control of all things. Remember, I said before that pride motivates us to take control, but equally so, fear motivates us to do the very same thing. And fear motivates us to do the same thing because ultimately to cry out persistently for help is to surrender ourselves to the one in whom we cry out to. Look down with me again. We're going to look at the widow again. We're going to read verses 3 and 4. It says, and there was a widow in that town who kept coming to him with the plea, grant me justice for my adversary. And for some time he refused. There's a couple of important details we need to notice in this story. The first, it seems a bit obvious because we've already been talking about her, but this woman is a widow. Now remember, Jesus' parables are short, punchy stories that teach us important lessons about the kingdom of God. And so to be very clear that Jesus doesn't ever waste words and he never ever wastes the details. He takes the time to tell us that this is not just a woman, but the person who is being wronged here is specifically a widow. And he tells us this because in Jesus' time, a widow was the image of a helpless person in need. So when this woman cries out for help from the judge, Jesus is intentionally telling us that she is a widow because the judge is not just her best option for relief. The judge is the only person who can help her. She has no one to defend her, and she has no way of avenging herself. Notice also with me at the beginning of verse 4, it says, for a while he refused. She pleads with him to do something, and it says, for a while he refused. I wonder how many of us have felt that. As you contend with God each day, as you contend each day with those who hurt you and mistreat you at work or at school, as you watch the news each night and feel overwhelmed daily by story after story of horribly unjust acts, even as you battle with the unrelenting thoughts in your head that will not give up, or as you fight the flesh of your body, you desperately want to deal with it, and yet it just persists. It leaves us feeling like the widow who pleads for the judge to do something, and yet for a while he refused. At the end of the previous chapter, just before this parable, Jesus is asked when the kingdom of God will come. The hope of the coming kingdom is a day where God will make all things right and where he will restore his creation. So the question in essence that they're asking is, when will that day come, Jesus? When is coming the day where you will make everything right? And Jesus' answer to them is rather underwhelming when we read it. He tells them it isn't something that they can know, but that it will most definitely come when they least expect it. And then he gives us this parable where he tells us to pray persistently while we wait for it. And so Jesus assures us that the day is coming and tells us to patiently wait. But again, if we're honest, it can be really, really hard to wait for that day. We've got a good number of kids in the room. Kids, I want you to turn to mum and dad next to you. What do you think the longest day in the whole year is? What's the longest day in the year, kids? It's a trick question. It's Christmas Eve. Specifically, it's the night before Christmas. See, every other night goes by like a flash. We have dinner, we have a bath, we get into bed, bedtime story, lights out, and it's tomorrow morning. But the night before Christmas, that is a night that drags on and on and on. The night feels so long because we long for the sun to rise tomorrow. And so the question for us as kids, when we face the night before Christmas, is what am I to do while I wait? What can I do while I wait for the sun to rise? As we look around and we see the injustice around us and we feel the struggles and the frustrations day by day in our own lives, it leaves us asking, what do we do for now? What am I to do while I wait for the relief of morning? And tonight you might be someone who is longing for the relief of morning. The circumstances you're facing at the moment might not even be the worst bit. It might be the fact that they are persistently going on. It makes you fear going back to the office tomorrow. It makes you fear going back to school tomorrow. It makes you scared of the idea of laying in bed with your own thoughts tonight. It might make you terrified of the next family dinner. What can we do while we wait for the relief of morning? And the answer that this parable gives us is that we can patiently submit ourselves to the judge. Jesus uses the image of a widow because it reminds us that whatever circumstances you and I are facing right now, we are the widow. We might try to fix them ourselves. We might try to right the wrongs that are happening in our lives. We might attempt to make things better in our own strength. But the reality is that we really need a good judge to fight our adversaries. We need the good judge to make things right. And so Jesus' words might feel really insensitive to you. All I want is for God to help me and to put things right. And Jesus' response to me in this parable is keep crying out and wait. If you've been suffering for a long time or you are gripped by some sort of injustice in your life at the moment, those words can feel like gravel in a wound. But it's important for us to remember that the same Jesus who tells us to cry out in prayer is the very same Jesus who cried out in prayer in the garden. The same Jesus who tells us to surrender ourselves patiently to God's will is the same Jesus who prayed, "Not my will, Father, but yours be done." The same Jesus who says all of this to the widow who faces her adversaries and continues to plead with the judge is the same Jesus who prayed in the garden for relief and yet was nailed to the cross. The same Jesus who tells us to cling to the hope that a day is coming where the Father will make things right is the same Jesus who was crucified and yet was resurrected from the grave and sits at the right hand of his Father. Brothers and sisters, Jesus' words in this parable are not insensitive because he knows exactly what you are suffering and how long you've been suffering it for, and he suffered for your sake. His words are an encouragement that regardless of what we're suffering, regardless of how long it's been going on for, we can fix our eyes forward on the hope that is to come. So Jesus draws his parable to a close by directing our attention to that very promise. Read with me one last time, verses 6 to 8. And the Lord said, "Listen to what the unjust judge says. And will not God bring about justice for his chosen ones who cry out to him day and night? Will he keep putting them off? I tell you, he will see that they get justice and quickly. However, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth?" Rather surprisingly here, Jesus encourages his listeners to actually listen to the words of the unjust judge. It's surprising because if we remember back, his description of this judge is less than favorable, if we're honest. He doesn't fear God. He doesn't care about the concerns and thoughts of others. He even makes it clear that the only reason that he responds in a positive way to the widow is out of fear that he himself will end up hurt. This judge is selfish, unjust, and concerned with no one other than himself. And yet Jesus says here, listen to what the judge says. Jesus, though, he isn't suggesting that we should take the path and the attitudes of this unjust judge. Rather, he's simply drawing attention to the fact that even in this unjust judge, the widow still found justice. Leon Morris, a commentator on Luke's gospel, makes this point. He says, "Since even an unjust judge can sometimes do justice, how much more must we expect that the righteous God will vindicate his people?" Jesus draws our attention to the unjust judge not to elevate him, but to elevate God as the far better heavenly judge. In Matthew 7, Jesus says to his disciples, "Which of you, if your son asks for bread, would give him a stone? Or if he asks for fish, will give him a snake? If you then, though you are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give good gifts to those who ask him?" Jesus' point in both these scenarios is that if we can find good gifts, or if we can find justice in sinful people in a sinful world, then how much more can you and I be confident that we will find justice in God, the perfect and powerful ruler of the universe? If a bad judge can sometimes act like a good judge, then how confident can you and I be that a perfect judge will always act like a perfect judge? How much more can we trust that God will do exactly what he has promised and that he will bring justice to the hurt? If you're here tonight and you in particular are facing long suffering, a longing for God to deal with your troubles, then this right here is the hope that Jesus points to, that means that we can cry out patiently and surrender to God's timing. For the Lord is a God of justice, says Isaiah. Blessed are those who wait upon him. Or as Paul declares in the letter of Philippians, a day is coming where every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. Amen. That is our hope, that our God is a God of justice, and through his Son, every wrong will be corrected one day. And so how is it then that you and I can press on in the face of injustice, in the face of suffering and pain? We can do it by fixing our eyes on heaven. Our hope of relief and restoration from our struggles isn't in this life, it's in the next. So our hope isn't found in a friend or a family member, the righting of a broken relationship. It isn't found in a program to make your life better. It isn't found in a political party who will fix our nation. It isn't found in a new lifestyle or a new way of life. Our hope for justice is found in God, our good judge, and his Son Jesus, who took our sin and suffering to the cross. There is nothing greater. Let's be very clear. There is nothing greater that we can do as we toil and struggle daily than to fix our eyes on heaven. There is nothing greater that you and I can do as we toil daily than to fix our eyes on our future hope. And so Jesus' words in this parable should bring great comfort to the hearts of the hurting. I think sometimes in our desire to be like Christ and to be godly, we can look at the widow's behavior in the midst of her suffering and reject it as unfaithful. Because isn't it ungodly to persist with God with the things you want? And shouldn't we just embrace suffering in this world because we are also broken? And again, to be clear, there is something right about those responses. We do need to submit our desires to God and trust that sometimes what He wants for us is not exactly what we want for ourselves. And the reality is that we are sinners, and so in some way we have contributed to the brokenness of our world. But Jesus' lesson here for us is to persistently pray that God would do the very thing He promised He would do. The petitions of the widow are not faithless cries, they are faithful cries, because she knows who can bring her justice. And so in faith, she cries out to Him. And Jesus reminds us that we know the good judge who has promised to make all things right. And so in faith, we surrender to the will of God and we cry out that He would do the things He has promised. What other hope do we have in the suffering of our world than the hope of glory to come? And what else can we truly do for now other than pray without giving up that God would do justice and that He would make all things right quickly? Church family, this is good news. If you are suffering, then there is a certain hope that a day is coming where God will bring you relief. And in His kindness and in His mercy, Jesus invites you and I to cry out daily that God would bring that relief and that He would bring it quickly.